that document I talked to you yesterday, I have another file. So I will try to finish it within next 3 days, and then we will send. Still there is time, because he's leaving for 25th, you said, right?
Yeah, right.
I will try, because next 3 days I have some time. So after today, I will try to finish it like marathon. Okay. Okay. Good morning to everybody. Okay. In my last week discussion on Nagarjuna, what we basically focused on was general matters like Nagarjuna's life, his time, also his work, those things. Now, that discussion provides with you the needed background knowledge on Nagarjuna. Today, I would be discussing with you how to interpret Nagarjuna, how to understand Nagarjuna. Now, when I say this, you might be thinking, why so much fuss about, interpreting and understanding Nagarjuna. Now, the main reason why we are studying Nagarjuna is really there is a challenge of understanding Nagarjuna, and understanding means interpreting Nagarjuna, basically because there is a difficulty to locate the context of Nagarjuna, historical role of Nagarjuna. I mean, you have a text, but that text is open for different interpretations. In fact, we can say that Nagarjuna is perhaps the most interpreted of all Buddhist scholars, philosophers, because so much has been written on Nagarjuna. If you take, say, modern scholarship, so much has been written on Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika and Nagarjuna's philosophy. Also, this concept of emptiness. There has been so much discussion on this. Now, why? Why there is so much discussion on this? That's a question we are going to look at in this context. And the problem of interpreting Nagarjuna is not something new. From the very period of, the Nagarjuna, after he wrote this text, there was this whole discussion about that. So it is not merely a present phenomenon. Like, we can say that, okay, modern people do not understand. It is because of that. No, it is not because of that. Even in the olden times, there was the issue about it. Now, the reason is mainly when you look at the text has fairly paradoxical way of saying things. And also the very concept of emptiness, shunyata, stated as sarvamidang shunyam. All this is empty. Now when you say all this is empty, people tend to understand this in many different manners. So, sarvam idam shunyam. Sarvam idam shunyam. All this is empty. All this is empty. Now when you say all this is empty, as a general statement, it tends to raise questions. Why do you say all this is empty? if it is empty, there is no meaning, then what is the point of doing all these things? So, this statement itself is a paradoxical statement. It has certain, iconoclastic. Iconoclastic means like, the breaking of, the reverential traditions. So, that type of flavor is there in this whole thing. So, therefore, even ancient times there was issue about interpreting Nagarjuna. Even today there is issue about interpreting Nagarjuna. How to understand what he says, in what context, and should we understand Nagarjuna at his face value, just what you see, or should we go deep into understanding him? In fact, in the course of these studies, I will be looking at with you some selected chapters. But today I will give you some examples of this issue of interpreting Nagarjuna. Now, Nagarjuna is perhaps the most commented upon and interpreted of all Buddhist philosophers. His MMK means Mula Madhyamaka Karika has been translated into English by Kenneth Inada, Frederick Streng, J. Garfield, and Kalupahana, among others. Each translation may be considered as an interpretation. Now, yesterday also I talked to you about this little bit. Now, each translation may be considered as an interpretation. Somebody can always ask why there are so many translations of one book. Here I am referring only to English translations. But if you take any other languages, there also can be translations into those languages. But if you take English translations, these are few. But there are a couple of more. I remember another translation translated according to the Tibetan tradition. So like that, if you look under, you can find there are many, the translations of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamika Karika. Now, the question is why there are so many translations. Okay, one way we can say that, okay, one translation was not right, therefore you make another translation, and both translations are not good, you make another translation, and so on. But interesting thing is the fact that there are many translations doesn't mean that other translations are necessarily wrong. But because translation is a way of understanding, when I translate the text, I translate it as the way I understand, right? Now, yesterday in the discussion, somebody raised this question because we usually, when we try to translate the text, particularly the canon, Tripitaka, we just go by the Buddha Ghosha. So we look at the sutta and then we go to commentary and we translate it. But here also there are commentaries, but commentators themselves have different interpretations. Then the question is, which commentator are you going to follow? Now, at least in the case of Theravada tradition, we have Buddha Ghosha. And then we do not have ancient tradition of contradicting Buddha Ghosha, right? We have only one tradition, namely Buddha Ghosha. So in the Theravada tradition, we go to Buddha Ghosha and see how Buddha Ghosha has understood this. Okay? But if we don't accept Buddha Ghosha, then we can give a different translation, but that has been a more modern thing. Up to very recent time, up to modern studies of Buddhism, practically nobody doubted Buddha Ghosha. Practically nobody doubted Buddha Ghosha. So everybody accepted Buddha Ghosha. I remember I had a fairly, the traditional, the teachers for me to teach when I was doing undergraduate studies. And then at some point, I remember asking a question about Buddha Ghosha. Then the senior monk who taught us Buddha Ghosha, he said, don't ask questions about Buddha Ghosha, you study Buddha Ghosha. I mean, that was the answer I got. So, ever since I did not ask questions from him about Buddha Ghosha, right? Because the idea was that you don't have to ask questions about Buddha Ghosha, you just accept it. So, that was the tradition. But in Nagarjuna's case, you can see that it is different. There are more than, there are many translations and many interpretations. Now the question is, which kind of interpretation are you going to accept? So I'm going to show you now these several different English translations depend on each translator's understanding. Now then there is a question, when you try to understand the text, how can different people understand the same text differently? Particularly the question becomes acute when you see that there is an accepted form of grammar, right? If you follow the grammar, can you give different interpretations? Because, that's a basic question. Of course, you can give an interpretation if you disregard grammar. But if you accepted the normal grammatical form of a text, how can you give different interpretations? So the interesting thing is, if you, when you read these translations, you can see that these translators who translated Nagarjuna, they were not disregarding grammar. They were not disregarding. In other words, they were accepting and respecting the grammatical traditions, but still you can see that you can give more than one interpretation to the same statement. I mean, that is something very interesting. Within the limits of grammar, still you can give a different interpretation. Then what you have is, we have set of competing interpretations. I have my interpretation, but of course I give that interpretation according to the accepted grammar. And somebody else can have his or her own interpretation, then again according to the accepted grammar. Then how are you going to say which one is right or which one is wrong? Which one is right or which one is wrong? It's a very serious situation. Particularly when we come to textual interpretation regarding Tripitaka, I will give you some examples in my methodology discussions, but I'm not going to go to the Pali examples today. But simply, when we look at Nagarjuna, we can see that Nagarjuna has been translated by so many people into English alone. And in Sri Lanka, we had a translation by another senior educated monk. It was a translation we had for many years, but then I thought I will retranslate Nagarjuna into Sinhala, which I did. And then again the question was, some people ask, so-and-so's translation is there, why do you have to translate it again? But then I said, well, I translated it again because, my interpretation is different. So you give the new interpretation again through the translation. But then my new interpretation also comes within the accepted grammatical tradition. Because I can't violate the grammar and accepted rules in order to interpret just to say what I want to say. I need to look at the text, respecting the grammatical and the linguistic conventions, then see whether I can the proposed different interpretation. So the idea that we have more than one interpretation is basically because of that. Nagarjuna's interpretation is not new. Nagarjuna interpretation is, history goes to Nagarjuna himself, who in Mula Madhyamika Karika, chapter 24, raises the objections of his imagined opponent and responds. Now, when we read Mula Madhyamika Karika, we will come to that chapter at some point. There is a chapter 24, Nagarjuna really raises the question his opponent would raise and then answer. So Nagarjuna himself was aware that there can be criticism to his position. So Nagarjuna in his own book raises the question and Nagarjuna answers. Now we will see that when we come to that chapter. But basically in that chapter what Nagarjuna does is, Nagarjuna's opponent says that if everything is empty as you say, there will not be a Buddha, there will not be a Dhamma, there will not be a Sangha, there will not be path, everything will be gone. So is that, Nagarjuna, what you want to say? Now you know that is a very serious charge. That's a very serious criticism of Nagarjuna. However, Nagarjuna himself mentions that this is what my opponent says. If everything is empty, everything will be gone. No Buddha, no Dhamma, no Sangha, no practice. So ultimately, what are you trying to do here? So Nagarjuna very interestingly shows that it is not the case. Actually, there will not be Buddha, Dhamma and the Sangha and the path if everything is not empty. So he really completely reverses the charges against him and he proves that there will not be Buddha if everything is empty, but it's not the case if everything is not empty. Then, you know, we can see that Nagarjuna gives a specific interpretation to what he means by empty. Okay. Now, why did he use the concept of emptiness? Now, we need to think about these things. But let me go today basically to see what Nagarjuna's interpretations. Now, there are two initial names, Buddhapalita and Bhavaviveka, who presented Prasangika and svatantrika interpretations, were the main interpreters of the past. Now, as I said, how to understand Nagarjuna's Mulamadhyamika Karika was issue from the very beginning. Okay, so these two authors, one is Buddhapalita, the other one is Bhavaviveka, who presented Prasangika and svatantrika interpretations, were the main interpreters. So Buddhapalita presented Prasangika. Now these are the two authors and these are the two terms they are ultimately proposing. According to Buddhapalita, what Nagarjuna doing was Prasangika. Tadhita that comes from that is Prasangika. So what Nagarjuna doing is Prasangika or Prasangavakya. I will explain what this is. And then Bhavaviveka said, no, it is svatantrika. When you say svatantra, svatantra means independent. Svatantra. So svatantra means independent. Independent means here you have to produce independent argument to substantiate your position. Now these two positions ultimately talk about Nagarjuna's philosophical methods. What does Nagarjuna do? Now basically what Nagarjuna does is in his work he is, we can say, demolishing or disproving many concepts. Now how does Nagarjuna do that? Why does Nagarjuna do this is also a question, but here a more important question is, how does Nagarjuna do that? Then there are two answers to that question. Nagarjuna demolishes other people's views. We can say, and for Nagarjuna, we can say demolishes others' views by showing, you can say, inner Nagarjuna demolishes others' views by showing inner contradictions of those views. That's interesting because whole idea is that in order to disprove other person's views, Nagarjuna, what he does is he takes the other person's view and shows that that view has contradictions, difficulties, weaknesses, and he demolishes it. Okay. Now, what is unique about this? Basically, whenever we want to demolish somebody else's view, what we do is we establish the opposite view. By establishing the opposite view, we demolish the other view. Now, this is basically what we do. Now, if we say that everything is anatma, other person will try to prove that no, everything is atma. So, by establishing the atma view, you disprove anatma view. Okay? Now, this is what usually we do. We always establish the opposite view. By establishing the opposite view, you disprove or demolish the other view. Then, but the interesting thing is when you do that, you have a view on your own which you use in order to criticize the other person's view. So you have a view and then you, based on that, you critique the other person's view. But here the whole issue is that Nagarjuna is trying to do is, Nagarjuna doesn't have a view. Nagarjuna does not have a view, and then Nagarjuna is trying to disprove the other person's view. Okay? The problem is this. Now, if you have a view, and then you try to disprove the other person's view, then in a certain manner, both of you are in the same boat. You also have a view, other person also has a view, and then you pit your view against the other person's view and show that your view is correct or your view is superior. But you do have a view. So it's like the two sides of the same coin. You try to, by proving the opposite, you try to prove your own view. Now, in Nagarjuna's philosophy, you know, this is really a problematic issue, because whenever you have your own view, you try to demolish other person's view, both are in fact guilty of the same error. Now you remember, for example, Avyakruta questions, Sassato loko, Asassato loko. Now these are two different views. One can hold that universe is eternal, Sassato loko. The other person can hold that universe is non-eternal. Actually, when there is a debate between the two people, one person want to prove that universe is eternal, other person want to prove that universe is not eternal. Then the interesting thing is both people who are debating accept the validity of the question. I mean, otherwise how can you debate? So the question is valid or question is meaningful, so you try to defeat one view and establish another view. But by sitting to do that, you accept the validity of both views. I mean, both views are meaningful. But some meaningful things can be false, some meaningful things can be true. Right? That is what we call truth value in a statement. Meaningful statements are, some statements are true, some statements are false. So here what is happening is the person who believes that his statement is true, he is trying to prove that other statement is false. But both are in the same footing. Both accept similar validity of the two claims, and then you try to prove one is not true and other is true. You see the point I am trying to make? Because suppose this is a metaphysical view, and then both are metaphysical views. So in accepting metaphysical views, both are similar, both are the same, but there are differences whether universe is eternal or whether universe is not eternal. So some say it is eternal, the other says that it is not. But basically that question they accept to be valid. What you say is, you have some kind of time-wise limitation to universe. Now, in the Avyakrita question, what the Buddha did was, Buddha said that Buddha did not answer either question. Now, what is the difference between that and accepting we even trying to prove it? Now, if the Buddha went to answer these questions, then in order to answer, you have to accept the validity of the question. Otherwise, if you don't accept the validity of the question, you don't answer it. The moment you try to answer it, you accept the question to be valid, isn't it? Moment you try to answer, you accept it valid. So, in the Buddha's case, what the Buddha did was, Buddha did not answer, kept the question aside. Of course, the reason given in the discourse was that, answering these questions are not useful for attaining nirvana. So only the kind of pragmatic answer, this is not useful. But philosophers have examined these questions very minutely and closely, have found that the reason is not only that. Why these questions are not useful? Then you can see that some of these questions are beyond our comprehension and the like. Now, if you say the universe is eternal or non-eternal, you think that to the universe there is some kind of time-wise duration. So, if you say eternal, although you make that statement, okay, universe is eternal, it will never be a part of, the experience of the person who is trying to establish. And if you say that universe is not eternal, then you say that universe at some point gets destroyed or become non-existent or something like that. But in either case, we are talking about something that goes beyond our comprehension. So that may be one reason to talk about whether universe is eternal or not. There can be other reasons. But the interesting thing is what the Buddha did was, Buddha did not answer these questions. So therefore the distinction between the Buddha and the two people who would debate the question is, the two people are in a way similar. Only thing is, they differ in their opinions about it. Okay. Now, for example, whenever you ask, I will give you another example. In the Avyakrita questions itself, there is an issue about tang jivang, tang sarirang, anyang jivang, anyang sarirang. Tang jivang, tang sarirang. The body and the jiva are the same. Anyang jivang, anyang sarirang. Body and the jiva are two different. Now, suppose Buddha wanted to answer this question, then Buddha has to accept the validity of the division of Jiva and Atma. Right? And then if you don't accept the validity of Jiva and Atma, how can you answer that question? But if you don't accept that there is something called Tang Jivan, Tang Sariran, Jiva, Jiva means Atma, then how are you going to do? The moment you try to answer that question, you commit to the distinction between Jiva and Atma, and also you accept that there is something called Atma. Now, when you accept that there is something called Atma, then you are trying to see the characteristics. But then you have committed an error there. But if Buddha is anatmavadi, Buddha doesn't accept the validity of Atma, then how can Buddha answer that question? Do you see my point? Because whenever you accept to answer the question, you already have committed to accepting that there is Atma. But how can Buddha do that? The moment you try to answer that question, you accept that there is something called Atma. But according to Buddhism, there is no something called Atma. It is something like if you ask whether Atma is red or blue. I mean, if you believe that Atma is there, then you can debate about whether it is red or blue. But if you don't believe that there is something called Atma, if something asks, is Atma red or blue, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Can you accept that question and try to answer? No, because in the first place, you don't accept that there is something called Atma. Now, if you don't accept that there is something called Atma, how can you debate about whether it is what color, red or blue? Can you? So, you see certain questions, even if you oppose, you have committed certain metaphysical mistakes. Now, that is why Buddha cannot answer that question. If you ask the color of the Atma, in order to debate the color of the Atma, you have to accept that there is something called Atma. But if you are a person who doesn't believe in that there is something called Atma, then how can you debate it? Somewhat similar question is, if somebody asks from you, have you stopped smoking? Have you stopped smoking? No or yes? No or yes? Now, if you say yes, what does it mean? You smoked before and you don't smoke now. And if you say no, that means you are still smoking. But the issue is, how would you answer? Suppose you have never smoked. Then what? How are you going to answer that question? You are a person who has never smoked. Okay? How would you answer that question? Have you stopped smoking? How can you answer that question? The moment you try to answer that question, you are in trouble. Then what should you do? Buddha said at some points, no kallo panyo. No kallo panyo. What does it mean? The question is not proper. Because, you have an improper question, wrong question. The moment you try to answer the wrong question, you are in trouble. The moment you try to answer this question, have you stopped smoking? I mean, the question says two things. You are smoking, have you stopped that? The question has two statements. Like these metaphysical questions also like that. When you say whether Atma and Jiva are the same, in order to answer that question, you have to commit to the claim that there is something called Atma and there is something called Jiva. For a person who doesn't believe that there is something called Atma, how can you talk about the characteristics of it? Whether it is eternal or non-eternal. Now you see, what I wanted to explain to you was this Prasangika method is to really look at the nature of the question and you dismiss the question by showing it is inner contradictions. So in other words, Nagarjuna did not want to be a participant of this metaphysical question. So according to Prasangika interpretation, they say that Nagarjuna never wanted to prove his own view. He just wanted to demolish others' views by showing inner contradictions of those views. Is that clear? I will come to this. And then Bhavaviveka, with svatantrika. Svatantrika held that, in fact, by doing this alone is not sufficient. Nagarjuna has to present his own arguments. Now, when you say Nagarjuna has to present his own argument, any argument has what is called major premise, what you want to prove in any argument. Now, whenever you present your own argument, you have to put something you want to prove. Now, in the Indian logical language, we use the word pratigna. Pratigna. Pratigna means thesis. Pratigna means thesis. In an argument, you have to give a pratigna. That means in argument, you have to show what you want to prove. Without showing what you want to prove, you can't have an argument. So when the svatantrika says Nagarjuna has to give independent argument, it means that Nagarjuna has to present his own argument with pratigna. That means with a thesis. Now actually, this can be a view. This can be a ditti or drusti. Now, if Prasangika interpretation is correct, Nagarjuna cannot give a argument, his own argument to support his position. But he can, of course, negatively critique. He can do the Prasangika thing, but not the svatantrika. So this is basically what the two traditions, Buddhapalita's Prasangika tradition held that Nagarjuna did not have present, any in his own arguments. Instead, Nagarjuna just demolished the other person's argument. But the Buddhapalita said that no, Nagarjuna had to present his own argument. But the issue is, can you present your own argument without thesis? No, because the nature of an argument is you have to have pratigna. Now, in fact, Bhavaviveka Svatantrika position comes with the development of Buddhist logic. In the Buddhist logical tradition, there was a scheme of, the presenting an argument. So people believed that Bhavaviveka was influenced by this development in Buddhist logical tradition. I will come to that point again later. But let us try to understand Buddhapalita's the Prasangika position. So basically, Prasangika position, this Prasangika is translated into English as reductio ad absurdum. This is a Latin term used in logic, in Western logic. Reductio ad absurdum means you reduce somebody's view into absurdity. You reduce somebody's view into absurdity. Or you disprove somebody's view. Another way to describe this would be to say, to show that if conclusion is correct, that will lead to a ridiculous situation. Like in an opponent argument, reductio ad absurdum means you look at the opponent's arguments, you show to the opponent, if your conclusion is true, then it will lead to some totally unacceptable further conclusion. So that is what it means. You reduce it to absurdity means. Let me give you an example actually. In order to understand this thing clearly, let me see. So basically Buddhapalita Prasangika did by establishing the opposite view. Now look at this. Reductio ad absurdum is to reduce the opponent view into absurdity by showing that if true, the argument results in an absurd conclusion. Like, you will, if argument is true, if the conclusion is true. Now, I'm giving you a familiar example from the Buddhist story. Look at this, take this as an argument. By taking bath in Ganga river, one's sins are washed away and as a result one is born in heaven. If by taking bath in Ganga, sins are washed away, then all the fish, tortoise, etc. living in the Ganga must go to heaven. But we know that fish, etc. do not go to heaven. Therefore, by taking bath in Ganga, you do not go to heaven. Now, do you remember this story? The story was a conversation between the slave woman called Punna and one of the Brahmins, right? Now, Punna was a slave, Dasi, slave woman working in for a rich family. And then in the early morning, in the extreme cold, she goes to Ganga river in order to fetch water. And then she sees this Brahmin dipping in the water early morning coldness. Then Punna says, well, I am coming here in the early morning to take water because I am a slave. But why do you have to do this? Why do you have to come early morning and dip in the water? Then he says, by dipping in the water, this is a sacred water, you go to heaven. Now, then Punna says, if by, the dipping in the Ganges water, you go to heaven, then what about all the fish and tortoise live in this river? So all of them must be going to heaven. Now, conversation is over from there. But what is the conclusion of the conversation? Now, she says rhetorically, if what you say is true, then all the fish in this river should go to heaven. Okay. That's a conclusion. But then what does it mean? What does the conclusion mean? What is the further conclusion?
Yes, that's true. So sometimes also true.
Yeah, the further conclusion is, we know that fish don't go to heaven. Therefore, you also don't go to heaven. So ultimately, what she wants to prove is, now this is a very good example for reductio ad absurdum type argument, right? You say, if you take bath in the Ganga river, then you go to heaven, right? Then you can say that all those who go to take bath in the river go to heaven. But then you can prove that all those take bath in the river do not go to heaven, because fish, simply your simple knowledge, you can see that they don't go to heaven. So therefore, the argument is what is called reductio ad absurdum argument, because it shows that the Brahminic position is really not true. So if you want to formulate this as an argument, Prasangika reductio ad absurdum type argument, you have to show that your conclusion conclusion leads to some kind of absurd situation. Now, in this story, what you have is, we know that the fish, etc., do not go to heaven. So ultimately, by taking bath in the Ganges river, you do not go to heaven. So this reductio ad absurdum argument is given by showing that it leads to some kind of very problematic or very ridiculous conclusion. Now, another important thing is, in this kind of argument, you see that only you show that if your conclusion is true, it will lead to ridiculous conclusion. But apart from that, this Punnadasi's case, she doesn't give any other reason. She doesn't prove that how fish do not go to heaven or anything like that. She simply says, if by doing this, you go to heaven, then all fish must go to heaven. But then the argument, fish do not go to heaven, therefore you do not go to heaven by doing that. So the whole argument is something like this. If you state in a logical form, if by taking bath in the Ganges river, you go to heaven, all fish in the Ganges should go to heaven. But all the fish in the Ganges do not go to heaven. Therefore, nobody goes to heaven by taking bath in the Ganges. So something like that. we can state the argument, something like that. And then that has a logical form. Now, in the Western logic, we use this concept called modus tollens. There is the logical form for this. I will introduce some of these terms to you. Modus tollens. Now, modus tollens is something like P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. This type of argument, P implies Q, not Q, this sign is not Q, therefore not P. Let me simply put, for convenience sake, not Q, therefore not P. So we can say P something like Q is now these are the two statements. By taking bath in Ganga, people go to heaven, or those who take. And then the Q is all fish in Ganga go to heaven. Now, as a logical statement, we can say that if P, then Q. Okay? P is by taking bath in the Ganga, people go to heaven. Now, in the logical statement, number one statement is if by taking bath in Ganga, people go to heaven, then all fish in Ganga go to heaven. Now, then second one is, okay, this is number one, this is number two, this is number three is concluded. Not Q means you say that number two is all fish in Ganga do not go to heaven. And then we have number three, conclusion. This means therefore, we can say by taking bath in Ganga, people do not go to heaven. Now, this is basically the modus tollens type argument. So, simple logical form is P implies Q, not Q, therefore not P. Now, P is by taking bath in Ganga river, Ganga, people go to heaven. Q is all fish in the Ganga go to heaven. So, the argument form is if by taking bath in Ganga, people go to heaven, then Q, all fish in Ganga should go to heaven. And then you say all fish in Ganga do not go to heaven. Because how do you say that? It's pretty obvious. It's pretty obvious, and if the number one is true, then what happens is, it is ridiculous thing to say that all fish in the Ganges will be going to heaven, right? Now this is what it means, that if your argument is true, it produces a ridiculous result. The Brahmin says that if you take in the Ganges, you go to heaven. Then if that is true, then all the fish and tortoise and other beings living in the river should go to heaven. Now, it doesn't happen. So, therefore, by taking bath, conclusion is this. Now, this is the form of reductio ad absurdum argument. This is the form of Prasangika argument. Okay? This is a form of Prasangika argument. Now, in a Prasangika argument, you show that if your conclusion is true, then look what happens. Now, the issue is that you are not taking part in that. You are not a part of the argument. You simply show that your conclusion is absurd. But as a person who pointing to that, I am not producing my own argument. So, according to Prasangika interpretation, what Nagarjuna did is that he did not produce his own argument. He used this form of modus tollens type form, and he said, this is what happens. Now, you see, this is what is called reductio ad absurdum, or the Prasangika type of argument, where you try to prove the opponent's argument by reducing it into absurdity. Okay? So, according to Buddhapalita, this is what Nagarjuna did. He did not come up with his own arguments, but he came up with showing the weaknesses of other person's argument. Okay. Yesterday we had a discussion that people should need a little break. So maybe we will take 10 minutes break and we will meet again after 10 minutes. And then you can have, if you need some questions, we can. Okay, we will take a short break. Okay, basically the reductio ad absurdum type argument, the shape is this. So now when we come to Bhavaviveka, Bhavaviveka's method is believed to have been influenced by the developments in Buddhist logic by Innaga and Dharmakirti, two of the greatest Buddhist logicians of Indian Buddhism. They presented a syllogism comprising thesis, reason and example, pratigna hetu udaharana. Bhavaviveka thought that Madhyamika should present independent arguments to support his position. Svatantrika criticized Prasangika for being negative. Now, the next method is what is called svatantrika. Now, this svatantrika Bhavaviveka lived around the 6th century. This is the time when the Buddhist logic was developing in India. And you know about Innaga, and also subsequently Innaga's pupil is Dharmakirti. So Innaga and Dharmakirti, these are the two greatest logicians who produced what you call Buddhist logic. Now, the Buddhist logic was so powerful during this period, so it is believed that Bhavaviveka may have been influenced by this Buddhist logical thinking. So what Bhavaviveka did was, he thought that, this only presenting a Prasangika argument and demolishing the other person's argument only by showing the weaknesses of the other person's argument is not enough. So Bhavaviveka said that in addition to that, the Madhyamika follower or the Nagarjuna should present his own arguments. Now, basically, what is meant by his own argument is when you present an argument, in the Indian context, in the Indian logical method, particularly developed by Brahmins and Nyaya tradition, they talk about syllogism. Syllogism means the logical statement. We are syllogism is this is a logical term we are using to refer to a logical statement. Now, basically, a syllogism, logical statement, or argument, according to Buddhist logicians, have three aspects. Like the first one is pratigna, then second one is hetu, and then you have udaharana. Udaharana means example. Hetu means reason. Pratigna means what is called thesis. Now, Buddhist logicians thought that syllogism, or in Sanskrit this is called sangvakya, syllogism, sangvakya. Sangvakya, syllogism. So, syllogism comprises three aspects according to the Naga and Dharmakirti. So, you have to have pratigna, then you have to give reason for that, and also example. Even among these three, according to Dharmakirti, pratigna and hetu are the most important things. Now, this three-aspect syllogism comes again as a development of Nayayika. Nyayas had 5-member syllogism: pratigna, hetu, udaharana, upane, nigamana. There were 5 things. But Buddhists said that, those all 5 are not needed, but basically the thesis, reason, and udaharana. Now here the important thing is pratigna, or thesis. In a regular argument, you try to propose something to prove. Otherwise, there is no argument. In an argument, what you do is you put up a thesis first, and then you want to prove that thesis. So, basically, this is what going to be your conclusion also. So, pratigna is the thesis, hetu is the reason, and then udaharana is what you give to support your conclusion. In the standard Indian logic, the example is something like this. We can say the mountain is F-I-E-R-Y, fiery. That means mountain has fire. Or simply we can say has fire. This is thesis. What you want to prove. And then reason is and example is number 3, like C-H-E, like kitchen. Now these are basically 3 things in the standard Indian logic. These 3. The mountain is fiery. Mountain has fire. Now that is what you want to prove. And the second is mountain has, because it has smoke. So the reason is that. And then you give the example like the kitchen. So anytime you see smoke in the kitchen, that means kitchen has fire. In the same manner, in a distance you see a mountain with smoking. So by seeing the mountain with smoking, you conclude that mountain has fire. So the mountain has fire is the thesis, what you want to prove, and then you give the reason, and then you give the example. Now, Bhavaviveka's claim is that Nagarjuna should produce this kind of argument in order to support his claim. What Nagarjuna did, usually according to Prasangika, is not really coming up with that kind of argument. He simply want to show that the other person's view is wrong, Okay. Now, this historical argument this debate has to be understood in a correct manner. Now, in one of his another books, Vigraha Vyavartani, Nagarjuna wrote, in order to answer the critics, he says at some point, Name asti pratigna. I do not have a pratigna. Pratigna means thesis. I do not have a thesis to prove. Now, what does he mean by this is, as I said earlier, every time you try to prove something by disproving the opposite, you also have your own view. Now, if you take ditti or drusti, if the ditti is a wrong thing, you cannot really refute one ditti with another ditti. Then the problem is, then you also have your own ditti. You think your ditti is correct, the other person thinks that his ditti is correct. But then this one ditti versus other ditti. Now, there is no difference between the two people. What the Nagarjuna wanted to do in a way was not having counter opposite ditti, but simply not having your own ditti. He just want to prove that other person's ditti. Now, like I gave you the example of Buddha's behavior towards Avyakruta questions. Now, Buddha never took this part or that part when Tanjivan Tansariram was raised, because Buddha can't take this way or that way, because the moment you accept the question, you are in trouble, because you accept that there is something called Atman, Buddha did not want. So this is something similar to that. So Bhavaviveka claimed that Nagarjuna should produce this kind of argument in order to support it. But Nagarjuna's position was that he did not have any thesis to prove. He was not really proving opposite view and disproving the opposite view and, trying to prove his own view. Now, when you go further, you will see that there is actually a little bit of a confusion also, because now, if Nagarjuna wanted only to demolish other people's argument, then we can always ask, Nagarjuna, why are you doing that? There must be some purpose. Then Nagarjuna will have to say that, I want to dispel this, the view that there is a subtle form of swabhava or one's own nature. So which means that ultimately, he has philosophical project, purpose. You can't say that, Nagarjuna wrote all these things just to demolish other people's views. Why do you demolish other people's view? Like, the whole point was that you have to have the right view, samyak drusti. But right view is not really another view. That's the important thing. Sammaditthi is not another ditti. Ultimately, if sammaditthi becomes another ditti, then it is not sammaditthi. Okay? So we need to really go into that debate, but for the time being, I'm not going to that much into it. But basically, I just want to show you the two positions, Bhavaviveka and Buddhapalita. Now, also you can see that just after now, these two people lived around 5th and 6th centuries, maybe 300 to 400 years after Nagarjuna. And then by that time, you can see that Nagarjuna's philosophy was already being interpreted. So, according to Bhavaviveka, it is one interpretation. According to Buddhapalita, it is another interpretation. So, the interpreting Nagarjuna is not something new. It goes to the very, very ancient period. Now, let me move on. Chandrakirti, by his commentary to Mulamadhyamika Karika, Prasannapada, established the Prasangika interpretation of Buddhapalita. He severely criticized svatantrika method. Now, in fact, among the many students of Nagarjuna, like those who study Nagarjuna, they believe that Nagarjuna was a Prasangika, because Chandrakirti was the greatest commentator of Nagarjuna, who wrote the commentary called Prasannapada. Now, in Prasannapada, Chandrakirti established that what Nagarjuna doing was Prasangika. So Buddhapalita proposed it, and then Chandrakirti established in his commentary. These two interpretations were tested with interpreting the first stanza of Mula Madhyamika Karika, first stanza of the first chapter. Now, basically this is the two arguments. Now, the first stanza of the first chapter goes as na svato napi parato na dvabhyang napi hetutah utpanna jatu jayante bhavah kvachana kechana. Its translation is no existence, bhava, whatsoever are seen anywhere that are arisen from themselves, swatah, from other, paratah, from both, dvabhyam, or from no cause, ahetutah. Now, this is how Nagarjuna starts. Na sato napi parato na dvabhyam napi hetutah utpanna jatu jayante bhavah kvachana kechana. I'm sorry, I think utpanna jatu vidyante. It should be, let me check that. Yes, I'm sorry. Not utpanna jatu jayante, utpanna jatu vidyante. Vidyante means seen. Now, here you can see Nagarjuna start his philosophical discussion with this idea, swatah, paratah, ubetah, and ahetutah. There is no existence bhavas arisen out of any of these four causes. That's what Nagarjuna says. In this chapter, Nagarjuna disproves the four positions without bringing any new arguments other than showing inherent contradictions in the four positions. Bhavaviveka thought that this is not sufficient. Now, I'm not going to detail into interpreting this stanza today, but when we read the text, we will start this. But then when you read this first chapter, you can see that Nagarjuna is disproving all these four positions, not bringing any of his own arguments. He just showed that, these four positions themselves are untenable. Now, the interesting thing is he doesn't have his own argument. He just demolishes the argument based on the weaknesses of, we will see when we read it. However, Bhavaviveka thought that, this is not sufficient. He thought that you have to really prove your argument by showing the opposite argument is false. For example, if Nagarjuna thinks that there are no bhavas that rise from swatah, one's own reason, then you have to prove that by an argument. But Nagarjuna does is something different. I mean, you must see the difference between these two positions. One position is, two positions are like this. Prasangika position is like, without answering the question, you critique the question and show that the question is not valid. Like what the Buddha did, no kallo panho. Then what happens is simply you critique the question and then you don't answer it. Because you say that question is not valid. Now this is what Nagarjuna seemed to be doing. Or this is what at least the Prasangika interpretation attributes to Nagarjuna. And then svatantrika means actually it's not. You accept that premise that things can be arisen from themselves, and then you try to disprove it by proving the opposite of that argument. So these are the two different things. Now actually this particular thing, we can see that when the Buddha was responding to the avyakruta questions, right? Avyakruta questions, Buddha did not accept to answer. And then in another place, somebody asks the question, ko vijnanaharang aharati. This comes in the Sanyutta Nikaya. The question asked is, ko vijnanaharang aharati. Ko vijnana aharam aharati. Who? Now, if I remember correct, this question was raised by Moliya Phaguna, and then ko, who? When this question was asked, Buddha said that no kallo panyo, the question is not correct. Now, what happens is, if the Buddha were to answer who takes the vijnana ahara, then you have to accept that there is some person who takes vijnana ahara. Actually, in actual fact, there cannot be any person independently of vijnana ahara. So, the questioner seemed to be thinking that there is some. Now, if the Buddha were to answer that question, now Buddha is guilty of the same mistake. Now, then the Buddha said that no kallo panyo, the question is not proper. Then the Buddha reframes the question, on what conditions vijnana ahara occurs. Now, when you say on what conditions vijnana ahara occurs, then there is no ko, who question, depending on what conditions. So you see the critique of the question. Now here the interesting thing is you have the critique of the view to reject it. So in other words, simply to remember this, we can say that there are two views to reject the view. One way to do that would be to reject the view by proving it is opposite. Second view is reject the view by showing that view itself is wrong. Or it involves, as in reductio ad absurdum, it involves some kind of unacceptable implication. So, these are the two main positions. And then when we come to Prasannapada of Chandrakirti support this position. So, therefore, it became pretty much established. Now, you see, there are situations when in philosophy you can claim the criticism of certain things, but without really claiming yourself to be having those views or ideas or anything. Now, one good example, in addition to what I showed from Buddhist tradition is, the example from Socrates. In the ancient Greek philosophy. In ancient Greek philosophy, Socrates is believed to have debated with many people on different matters. Now, Socrates famously said that only thing he knows is that he doesn't know. Right? He said very famously, only thing he knows is that he does not know. But then, how can he maintain that? Okay, he would go to a judge and ask a question on justice. Now, justice is the main concern of a judge. When you are a judge, of course, you are delivering your judgment, then, justice is the main thing. But Socrates would go to a justice and ask what justice means. Of course, it is an insult because any justice should know what justice means. But then Socrates asks what it is. Then justice would say, okay, justice is this. Then Socrates shows that, no, that is not justice. Okay? Now, judge gets confused because, he gave an idea, okay, this is justice. Socrates shows that it is not. Then the judge will give another interpretation. Okay, then justice is this. Socrates would prove that that also is not the case. So in this manner, judge would give several interpretations or several meanings to justice. Each and every meaning is rejected by Socrates by showing internal contradictions. Then finally, justice will ask, okay, Socrates, then you tell me what justice is. Then what is the Socrates answer? Socrates says, please don't ask from me, I don't know. I don't know. So you don't ask me, but you're supposed to know it because you are a justice. So judge should know what justice means. That's why I ask from you, but don't ask me, I don't know. He says, only difference between you and me is, I know that I don't know, but you don't know that you don't know. You think that you know what justice means, but actually you don't know. But in my case, I know that I don't know justice. Now what is this whole conversation? Although Socrates says that only thing he knows is that he doesn't know, I mean that lack of knowledge Socrates referring to must be a very enlightened type of lack of knowledge, right? Not ordinary person, because he has the knowledge to disprove what the judge says. But on the other hand, when he was asked what the justice is, he simply would say, no, I don't know. Now, the point I want to show you is this. So, in a particular manner, you can be dissociating yourself, but still you can prove the other person is wrong, right? Now, when the judge says that, okay, this is justice, one way to Socrates can do is to prove the opposite view and show that what the judge says is wrong. But Socrates doesn't go on to do that. He simply shows that the definition or the statement made by the judges simply cannot hold. Now, there is somewhat similarity between Prasangika and svatantrika positions. So, Prasangika position is something like what Socrates did. Right? He would show what the judge says is not tenable. But on his part, he will not give a definition to justice. On his part, he will simply say, I don't know. But while not knowing what it is, still you can prove that particular idea is wrong, right? So, this is the two types of interpretations produced, the interpreted, used to interpret Nagarjuna, and then subsequently Buddhapalita's Prasangika view was established by Prasannapada, so it became much more familiar, and then more recently critics like T.R.V. Murthy supported that particular Prasangika type interpretation. However, people like the Kalupahana and some others think that Nagarjuna really had the positive message to give. But there we have to understand that in a somewhat different manner. It doesn't necessarily mean that Nagarjuna had to give independent argument. But ultimately somebody has asked the question, why does Nagarjuna go on demolishing other people's view? What is the purpose of that? Now, I think in order to answer that question, we will have to go to the Buddhist practice. So, according to my belief, Nagarjuna was doing that in order to get rid of all the views. But getting rid of all the views is a part of Buddhist path. So anyway, we will be looking at it in more detail subsequently. So this is basically what Nagarjuna, they meant by this. Basically the two positions according to which Nagarjuna was interpreted. Okay, I will stop at that before I proceed into. Do you have any questions or comments or anything you don't have any difficulty understanding about the things I discussed so far? Yes.
Nagarjuna philosophy, reminiscing, one of the books, opinion, say minutes word.
Who?
Nagarjuna philosophy and Brahminism.
Brahminism?
Yeah. One of this book. Same minutes word. Brahminism's book, father as his child. My son, this fruit. This fruit is cut this fruit, and then seed, and then cut, no other than. Nagarjuna philosophy, same meanings word, I think. What Professor, how do you think?
What do you see the connection? I think you are referring to this Upanishad story where the father wants his son to bring a banyan fruit, and then you cut the banyan fruit, and then you find the banyan seeds, and then you find then you split the banyan seed. But where is this huge banyan tree? But father says that in some very mysterious manner, banyan tree is in the seed, right? That's the story you are referring to, right? Is that the one? No, I know that, but you. Okay, but earlier your story is that right? Okay, but how do you say Nagarjuna's philosophy is like that? Because in that Upanishadic story, in the story the father wanted to show that although this banyan tree is such a huge thing, it contains in this seed in a very mysterious manner, where you can't explain it. When you split the seed, you don't see a banyan tree. But on the other hand, without the seed, there will not be a banyan tree. So in that Upanishadic Brahmana story, father wanted to prove that Atma is something like that. You don't see it, but of course it is pervading all. But Reverend, I don't see a connection between that and Nagarjuna's philosophy. Because Nagarjuna's philosophy, of course, there are many ways to understand. The way I understand, I think Nagarjuna's philosophy belongs into the Buddhist path, where he is trying to remove this idea of svabhava, one's own nature. So that is, I think. So two stories, I think, are not connected, according to my understanding, as I see right now. Okay? Yes, sir.
Nagarjuna philosophy, I understand. Everything is nothing. He proves nothingness. Nothing is inclusion, I think. And also, Socrates said, "Oh, I know that I know nothing." And another flaw, this is he argues everything. For example, I think he takes some idea from aspect in Theravada Buddhism, Anamagatandaro, like that. Anamagatandaro, and there is no beginning, there is no end. In his philosophy, everything is nothing. For example, someone thinks a road is a snake. He sees, but it's rounding. Seeing knowingly wrong and unknowingly wrong. US already gives a three logic gate, and thesis, reason, and example. How if we get antithesis? For example, the mountain is man are mortal like that, man are immortal like that. For example, antithesis and reason. At the time, how can I make it validity? Nagarjuna philosophy and Socrates and one of the ideas in Buddhism, Namagadandaro, like that. How can we make it valid in these three concepts? This is one of my first question. And my second question.
Hold on. Even your first question, you have to have several questions within that. Look. In fact, Reverend, in this whole course, we have not yet started reading Nagarjuna and really looking at what he says. What Nagarjuna is really doing you will perhaps change your question subsequently when we read chapters, because we have not studied any chapters yet in this discussion. Maybe you have studied some of these things earlier. But what is Nagarjuna's philosophy, we can read and see in the text. And then, again, of course, it doesn't mean that you have to accept what I say, what it is, but you can read on your own. But then we can keep on reading and see what it means. But basically, today what I tried to show you is these two philosophical methods, like Prasangika and svatantrika. Now, these are two different interpretations. Now, today I am more concerned whether you have any difficulty or any question about those two methods, because once we understand these two methods, in future, if you want, you can be a Prasangika type of interpreter, or you can be a svatantrika type of interpreter. It is up to you. So, but exactly what Nagarjuna does can't be given a very short answer, because we really has to refer to his text and say, okay, this is what he means. But when you say Nagarjuna is nothingness, I would say that I will show you in the discussion that is not what Nagarjuna means, that is not Nagarjuna means. But I can't do it today, right? Because it will come in future. So, thank you anyway for the question. Do you have any questions about svatantrika or prasangika methods or anything, any formula, any logical discussion we had, anything related to that? Okay, first you.
In the Nagarjuna philosophy, there was no deceit, there was no own argument, own truth.
Yeah, okay.
But you recited one stanza. That stanza is a composition or composed by the Nagarjuna.
Which one?
I just call.
Ko viññāna harangaharati? No, that is.
No. You recite. I don't remember.
Oh, you mean the stanza? Yeah, that was from Nagarjuna. Yes.
Nagarjuna, he himself claimed his argument.
Yeah. Well, that itself is, how can you say that? What he says is, he refers to these four positions and says, jatu vidyante, they are not seen. Now, when you try to understand the Nagarjuna's philosophical method, he is using the word, he doesn't say, there are no. He says, you cannot see. Now, there's a big distinction between the saying that there is no such thing and saying that no such thing is seen. Because whenever you say vidyante, now when we read Nagarjuna, we will see that Nagarjuna is always using this verb, vidyate, vidyante. Now, vidyate, vidyante means it is not seen. So, Nagarjuna goes by your experience. Actually, any person, the safest thing is to go by experience. If I say that I don't see it, it is not to be seen, then I am within what is called experience. So, Nagarjuna says, na vidyante. I mean, that is a statement he makes. And then subsequently in the chapter he shows why such a thing is not seen. But anyhow, he doesn't make this very, ontological, statement about the existence of things. He doesn't say those things don't exist. He says that those things are not to be seen. So, of course, that is the initial statement. Once you make the initial statement, then Nagarjuna goes on showing that swatah, ubetah, paratah, ubetah, ahetutah, all four positions cannot be sustained. Actually, Reverend, now Nagarjuna's that first statement is not an argument. He is making a general statement. And then he goes on showing that who says that things arise swatah by its own, not Nagarjuna. Some people say paratah from other. Some people say ubetah, both. Some people say ahetutah. So it is not Nagarjuna's view. Nagarjuna just say that some people say this, some people say this, some people say this, some people say this. And Nagarjuna says, but cannot be seen any of those things. That's all Nagarjuna says. So don't think that the first statement is an argument. No, it is a statement. Of course, you will have to open your mouth and talk. Otherwise, there cannot be a philosophical discussion. So this is how Nagarjuna start the discussion. But it is not an argument. Argument means you have to have always a reason to prove what you say. That is the whole point of an argument. Now, even in when we were talking about research methodology, I will explain to you, we have to have arguments to prove what we say. Arguments to prove means we can't just make assertions or statements. We have to give reasons why we make that assertion. So here Nagarjuna doesn't give any reasons. He simply says these four positions are not available. That's all Nagarjuna says. Okay, so therefore you will start seeing this more. So that very first statement on the first chapter is not argument. He simply says these are what some people say, but these things are not seen. That's all. Well, ultimately, now emptiness, I will show you. Nagarjuna uses this concept in particular contextual sense. Not that everything is nothing or something. But again, we will have to go to the text, okay? Reverend?
Okay. I'm not familiar with Nagarjuna philosophy. So you also, according to you, Nagarjuna demolishes other views. Concerning this, does Nagarjuna philosophy has a contradictory view on Buddha's views on the cosmic infinite?
So you think Nagarjuna's philosophy thinks that Buddha's philosophy is contradictory or something? Is that what you mean? Well, Reverend, this again has to be judged on how we understand Nagarjuna. Now, when we look outside, you feel that Nagarjuna is really rejecting all these views. But actually, when you read carefully, you can see that ultimately what Nagarjuna is trying to do is to show that any of these things cannot be understood as having self-nature. You see? I mean, that is the main idea. Now, for example, he will talk about karma or karma vipaka. But then that doesn't mean that he is rejecting karma or karma vipaka. But what he is rejecting is understanding karma or karma vipaka as involving persons or dharmas. Like Buddha's case, when the question ko viññāna āharang āharati was asked, Buddha said that question is wrong. But when the question is rightly put, on what conditions viññāna occurs, then Buddha answers that. Like that. Nagarjuna many people think that, okay, Nagarjuna rejects all the concept in Buddhism. Nagarjuna rejects Buddha, Dhamma and the Sangha and everything. But actually that is not what he is doing. What he is doing it to understanding these things in the correct manner. Wrong manner is to understand any of these concepts from Swabhava point of view. Okay, that's what it means. But Reverend, all these things will be more clear because we did not start reading the text yet. I'm just giving you some ideas to make use of in the process of understanding. But we will see that. But we could debate about this all the way through, okay? Because you will not agree with what I say, but that's fine because nobody has to agree with everything that is said 100%. But I want you to develop your own way of reading it. So we will read the text and should not be a problem. So. Okay, now Prasangika method, reductio ad absurdum method, is that clear to you?
Yes.
So that's no problem? Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Yes. Honestly, I have never read about Nagarjuna. So I don't know much. I just want to clear now. You mentioned, you expressed to understand about Nagarjuna conclusion, cosmic
Yes.
different types of confusion.
Yeah.
So these two types is we need to understand to read how he is mentioned, how he expressed.
Mhm.
Is that right?
In fact, that there are more than one translation means that there is more than one way of understanding Nagarjuna. The problem, challenge is that what I wanted to say is now when we look at the Buddhist suttas, in the Theravada tradition we have Buddha Ghosha and then we have Buddha Ghosha alone. So either you accept Buddha Ghosha or don't accept. But here the difficulty is, even in the classical time we have Buddhapalita and Bhavaviveka. So which way do you want to go? So now for example, some people will think that Buddhapalita's Prasangika method is the proper method to understand Nagarjuna. Now in fact, this afternoon we are reading some text. After that, next week, I want to read a chapter from T.R.V. Murthy. Now, T.R.V. Murthy is one philosopher who thinks that Nagarjuna is Prasangika. Now, if you say Nagarjuna is Prasangika, then there is a way to interpret Nagarjuna. But on the other hand, if you think that Nagarjuna is svatantrika, then there is another way to interpret Nagarjuna. So, there can be basically two different translations anyway. Two different translations. So, it depends on how you interpret. Actually, now, as I said, I myself translated Mula Madhyamika Karika into Sinhala, but my whole perspective is that Nagarjuna is a follower of the Buddha. What he is doing has to be understood as a part of the practice of the path. So, according to that interpretation, it is not everything is nothingness or anything. But everything is nothingness is, the kind of popular interpretation given by many people. But really, in order to give an interpretation to Nagarjuna, you have to really carefully read the whole thing. And then only you start seeing what Nagarjuna is doing. Okay. So, the fact that there are many translations means from the early period. So, this svatantrika Prasangika, and then Chandrakirti went into Prasangika method and established that. But then, in either method, even in the Prasangika, okay, Nagarjuna goes on demolishing all the views. Then you can ask Nagarjuna, what are you doing? Why do you do that? Then, of course, Prasangika interpretation says that the ultimate truth is something beyond words. You cannot express that through words. That's why the Nagarjuna reject all views. So when it comes to Nagarjuna view, Nagarjuna would say it is beyond words. Now this is the Prasangika interpretation. But then I, as a student of, the Nagarjuna, like, who is trying to understand, I don't believe that. I think Nagarjuna is doing something else. But T.R.V. Murthy is a world-renowned authority of Nagarjuna, so he thinks differently. So, it's like that. So, in a class like this, what we trying to do is, on the one hand, be knowledgeable about all these interpretations. The other thing is, we try to develop our own interpretation, hopefully. These are the two things that we are doing. Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, then we will wind up today's discussion from this. Next time I will go into the beginning verses of Nagarjuna, and I will be also talking to you to whom Nagarjuna is responding to. Now the answer is, it is to his own Buddhist brothers who held the view of Swabhava, therefore Dharmavada. So in my next discussion, I will be discussing mainly with you what Dharmavada or what Swabhava view is. And then after that discussion, we will move into the text. And then afternoon, we will meet to read the text. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.